August 1943, somewhere in the Mediterranean theater. Kim Philby sat in a secure office reviewing intelligence reports about German defensive positions in Italy, his role as a senior officer in Britain's secret intelligence service giving him access to some of the most sensitive Allied planning for the upcoming invasion of mainland Europe. He was 31 years old, Cambridge educated, spoke perfect German and Arabic, and had risen rapidly through British intelligence based on competence and the kind of old boy connections that defined the British establishment. His colleagues trusted him completely. His superiors considered him a future leader of the service, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's intelligence staff relied on his assessments when planning operations that would cost thousands of lives. What none of them knew, or at least what none of them admitted knowing, was that Kim Philby was working for the Soviet Union and had been since 1934, passing British secrets to Moscow through a network of handlers and dead drops that operated right under the noses of British counterintelligence. And what makes this story truly remarkable isn't just that Philby betrayed Britain for nearly 3 decades, it's that evidence suggests Winston Churchill and senior intelligence officials may have known or strongly suspected his loyalty was compromised and let him continue working anyway, because a double agent you know about is more useful than a double agent you arrest. Before we dive into how Britain's intelligence establishment was penetrated by Soviet spies and why Churchill might have deliberately allowed it to continue, like this video because it helps reach more history enthusiasts like yourself. Let's get back to the 1930s, when a group of Cambridge students decided the future belonged to communism and began the most damaging espionage operation in British history. Kim Philby had been recruited into Soviet intelligence in 1934 while still at Cambridge University, part of the infamous Cambridge 5 spy ring that included Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross. These weren't working-class revolutionaries or foreign infiltrators. They were products of Britain's elite. Privileged young men radicalized by the Spanish Civil War and the failure of Western democracies to effectively oppose fascism. Philby's Soviet handler had given him specific instructions to avoid overt communist activities, build a conventional career in British government or intelligence, and position himself for long-term access to sensitive information. Philby followed these instructions perfectly, working as a journalist covering the Spanish Civil War, where he carefully cultivated a reputation as a right-leaning conservative, then joining British intelligence in 1940 when the war created demand for educated men with language skills and international experience. By 1941, Philby was working in Section 5 of the Secret Intelligence Service, the Counterintelligence Division, responsible for combating enemy espionage, which meant a Soviet spy was literally running British operations against foreign intelligence services, including Soviet intelligence. The irony was so perfect it seemed impossible, but Philby's performance was excellent, his analysis sharp, and his social connections impeccable. He produced genuine intelligence work that helped identify German agents while simultaneously passing everything he learned to his Soviet handlers through meetings in London and materials hidden in dead drops. His position gave him access to British intelligence operations across Europe, Allied strategic planning, and perhaps most valuable to Moscow, British assessments of Soviet military capabilities and political intentions. The intelligence Philby passed to the Soviets during the war was extraordinarily damaging in ways that wouldn't become clear until decades later. He compromised British intelligence networks in occupied Europe by revealing to Moscow which resistance groups and agents Britain was supporting, information the Soviets used to eliminate non-communist resistance movements that might challenge Soviet influence after the war. He passed details about British cryptographic capabilities, including the Enigma program, though the Soviets apparently didn't share this with the Germans because they wanted Britain to keep reading German communications and sharing selected intelligence with Moscow. He provided Soviet intelligence with British assessments of German strength on the Eastern Front, Wehrmacht strategic planning, and Allied decisions about resource allocation between theaters, all of which helped Stalin make informed decisions about Soviet military operations. But here's where the story becomes genuinely strange. Evidence suggests that by 1943, British counterintelligence was receiving indicators that Soviet intelligence had penetrated senior levels of British intelligence and government. Intercepted Soviet communications contained references to sources in London providing high-level intelligence. Patterns of Soviet behavior suggested they had access to information beyond what was officially shared, and some British intelligence officials were beginning to suspect that the Cambridge recruits from the 1930s might have remained ideologically committed to communism despite their outward careers. The question is what Churchill and senior intelligence leadership did with these suspicions. The conventional narrative is that British intelligence was incompetent and couldn't identify the moles in their ranks until Soviet defectors provided evidence in the 1960s. But an alternative theory, supported by some historians and intelligence analysts, is that Churchill made a calculated decision to monitor suspected agents rather than arrest them, using them as channels for controlled information flow to Moscow. The logic was ruthless but strategically sound. If you arrest a suspected spy, the Soviets know you've identified them and will change their methods and recruit new sources. But if you identify a spy and leave them in place while controlling what information they can access, you can use them to feed the Soviets intelligence you want them to have, while monitoring their activities to identify their handlers and networks. This theory suggests that Churchill may have known or strongly suspected Philby and other Cambridge spies were compromised, but calculated that their continued operation was more valuable than their arrest. During the war, Britain and the Soviet Union were allies against Germany, and Churchill needed Stalin to keep fighting on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were killing the majority of German soldiers. If Stalin believed he had sources inside British intelligence providing him with genuine secrets, he would trust Britain more and be more willing to coordinate operations. And if those sources were actually controlled and being used to feed Moscow information that served British strategic interests, then the espionage was actually working in Britain's favor. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial but intriguing. Philby received assignments throughout the war that gave him access to sensitive information but kept him away from the most critical secrets, as if someone was managing his access. British intelligence sharing with the Soviets sometimes included information that Philby had also passed independently, which could mean British intelligence was validating Philby's reporting to Moscow to maintain his credibility. And several documented cases exist where British intelligence appeared to deliberately feed information through channels they knew or suspected were compromised, suggesting controlled use of double agents rather than simple security failure.
Montgomery's intelligence staff provides a specific example of how this might have worked in practice. Philby had access to intelligence assessments being prepared for Montgomery's operations in North Africa and Italy, information about Allied force dispositions, strategic objectives, and timing that would be valuable to the Soviets for their own planning. If Philby was being monitored and his access controlled, British intelligence could ensure he saw information they wanted Stalin to know, accurate intelligence about Allied operations that would help the Soviets coordinate their own offensives, while keeping him away from details about British political objectives or strategic disagreements between the Western Allies and Moscow that Churchill wanted to keep private. The challenge with using double agents this way is that you can never be completely certain they're only passing the information you want them to pass. Philby was skilled and experienced. He had been trained by Soviet intelligence, and he was ideologically committed rather than operating for money or coercion. Even if British intelligence suspected him and tried to manage his access, he might have been obtaining and passing information beyond what they intended. The risk was that your controlled double agent was actually controlling you, using your attempt to manipulate him as cover to continue genuine espionage. Philby's wartime activities continued through 1945 and into the post-war period, when he was promoted to head of Section 9, the new counterintelligence division specifically targeting Soviet espionage. A Soviet spy was now running British operations against Soviet intelligence, and if Churchill or senior officials knew or suspected this, it represented either catastrophic security failure or extremely sophisticated intelligence manipulation. Philby used his position to compromise British operations against Soviet intelligence, protecting Soviet networks and warning Moscow about British surveillance and recruitment operations. He continued this work until 1951, when the defection of Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean triggered intensive investigation that finally put him under direct suspicion. Even then, Philby wasn't immediately arrested. He was forced to resign from SIS in 1951, but wasn't prosecuted, and he worked as a journalist in Beirut, where he continued passing intelligence to the Soviets until finally defecting to Moscow in 1963, when evidence against him became overwhelming. The fact that he operated for nearly 3 decades, despite multiple investigations and growing evidence of his treachery, suggests either remarkable incompetence by British counterintelligence or a deliberate decision to monitor rather than arrest him, because his continued operation served British interests. The historical debate about Philby and the Cambridge spies centers on whether British intelligence was penetrated due to incompetence and class loyalty that made upper-class officials reluctant to suspect their own kind, or whether Churchill and senior spy masters made calculated decisions to use known or suspected double agents for strategic deception. The incompetence theory is supported by the fact that obvious warning signs were ignored for years, and that British counterintelligence failed to identify the spies until Soviet defectors provided evidence. The calculated manipulation theory is supported by patterns of access control, information flow, and strategic decisions that suggest British intelligence was managing compromised agents rather than simply missing them. What's undeniable is that Philby and the Cambridge network compromised British intelligence throughout World War II and into the Cold War, passing secrets to Moscow that shaped Soviet strategic decisions and damaged British operations. Whether Churchill knew and allowed it to continue as controlled deception, or whether British intelligence was simply incompetent and couldn't catch their own spies, changes how we understand the espionage, but doesn't change the fact that it happened. The double agent working for Montgomery's intelligence staff was passing information to Stalin, while British officials either didn't know, couldn't prove it, or deliberately allowed it to continue because a spy you know about is more useful than a spy you arrest. The broader lesson is about the complexity of counterintelligence during alliance warfare, when your ally is also your intelligence target and your own agents might be working for them. Churchill needed Stalin to keep fighting Germany, which meant maintaining the alliance, even while suspecting Soviet espionage against British interests. If arresting Philby would damage relations with Moscow or alert the Soviets that Britain had identified their networks, then allowing him to continue while managing his access might be the strategically sound decision, even if it meant tolerating espionage. The calculation was ruthless, cold, and exactly the kind of intelligence tradecraft that Churchill understood, even if it meant letting a traitor keep working.
If this story of the double agent who might have been deliberately allowed to operate made you see wartime intelligence differently, subscribe if you haven't already, because we're covering the stories where espionage and counterespionage become impossible to distinguish, and the line between security failure and strategic deception disappears completely. Drop a comment telling us whether you think Churchill knew about Philby and used him for deception, or whether British intelligence was simply incompetent and couldn't catch their own spies, because that question gets to the heart of how intelligence services operate when the truth is more valuable than loyalty.